Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here. I am Dr. Patrick O'Malley, emergency physician and founder of Shift Change. And a quick word on what this is. Shift Change is a community for emergency and urgent care clinicians who want to do something beyond the bedside. And whether that is building a business, creating a non-clinical income stream, or figuring out what's next. There are courses in a video library, but it's not a course platform, and it's not another Facebook group. It's a place to connect with people who are doing the work and to start building something real. Learn more at myshiftchange.com. Now to today. Most of us spot broken workflows and unmet needs every single shift that we work, and we complain about it, and we work around those issues, and then we move on. What we don't do is realize that those frustrations can become a platform, a consulting gig, a product, or a business. And that's what we're getting into today. Real examples, common mistakes, some basics on intellectual property and funding, and how to test an idea without blowing up your whole clinical career. And I'm excited about our speaker. I first connected with Dr. Natalie Bonthius probably about 2 years ago when she was still in residency, and I was blown away by what she had already built. She's an emergency physician and a Wilderness and Austere Medicine Fellow at Dartmouth Hitchcock and founder of Survival Med, a wilderness medicine education company that's trained more than 40,000 students across the country. And she started this as a medical student, which tells you everything about how she operates. Natalie, thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I'm very, very happy to be here doing this recording for you guys. I think that this is a really cool journey I've been on, and I'm happy to share how it's gone and the difficulties I've had with it, and also the successes along the way. And hopefully, this kind of serves anybody else that's looking to start a venture of their own, or just even interested in testing the ideas. And if it's cutting out at any point, just let me know
Okay.
too.
Yep.
So the Wi-Fi can be a little touchy, and I'll just switch it out. But um, so this is just about owning the work that you're already doing, obviously, in the title. And I think that this is a really important message for physicians of all kinds to hear, both in emergency medicine and outside of it. I think it applies really no matter what field you're in, and even no matter what kind of practitioner you are, at all levels of healthcare. I think these same principles really apply. Um, so just a couple disclosures before we start. So I did found and own Survival Med. It's a wilderness medicine education company. It still is very active and growing, and I still own and operate it every day. And I'm an emergency physician. I'm not a CPA, not a business attorney, not a patent expert or a certified financial advisor. So I can't claim that anything that I say in this talk is, professional advice in any capacity. But I think that the irony of that statement is that this is perhaps why it's a valuable message for other physicians. I started with really no baseline knowledge in any of these things, and I still consider myself fairly, an amateur in a lot of these categories. But I just want people to know that you don't have to be an expert in any of those categories to build something that is really successful. And so that I think that that's why this message has really impacted people. So I think the goals overall of this talk are not to kind of turn it into some kind of pitch or coach other physicians into how to pitch their idea necessarily, but it's more to recognize that the work that they're already doing is so conducive to building something out of it that they own. And so we're going to start by just identifying gaps in specifically the emergency setting, which is just what I'm the most familiar with because I practice in it. But again, this applies really in every specialty. The same themes apply. Analyze those kind of features of specifically emergency medicine and other specialties that can lead to innovation. And then apply a concrete framework to basically develop a solution to meet those needs that you're seeing no matter where you're working. And I think that a really important point is that I don't believe every physician should start a company. But the point is that improving the broken systems around you is already part of patient care and can easily become projects that are bigger than that, bigger than just that limited setting, if you see it as that kind of opportunity. So to start off, I'll just share a couple broad examples of how things really are innovation, even in the world we're already living in clinically. So if you imagine it's like 1:30 in the morning and every hallway bed in your emergency department is totally full. You have a septic patient waiting for an ICU bed. You have an elderly patient who's just becoming delirious under the fluorescent lights. Everyone is stressed out. There's no space for patient care. And I think a lot of the discussions for a long time revolved around how the emergency physicians could just better tolerate these problems rather than actually redesigning the system that created it. And everyone recognized it as dangerous, but again, it always just fell on the emergency department to deal with this kind of issue. And let me see if I can get my stuff to go. So one person started thinking differently about that, and that was Peter Bocelli. He's an emergency physician at Stony Brook, and he just approached the problem differently. So instead of asking, how to manage the problem better inside the emergency department and continue just suffering through that, he asked why these admitted patients couldn't be, why were they physically trapped there in the first place? And so he developed essentially the first full capacity protocol is what it was called. And this simply just redistributed the admitted patients into the inpatient hallway spaces once everything had filled up. And the idea was very, very operationally simple. You're just redistributing people throughout the hospital. And it was initially very controversial because those hallway beds had always been treated as just unacceptable spaces for boarded patients. But the ED was somehow quietly normalized in that capacity. But over time, it really gained a lot of steam. And there were studies done on this, and it showed that it really reduced the risk to the patients. They had much better outcomes, and they were much happier. And essentially, the whole system was much happier and more functional. And, a lot of people overwhelmingly preferred it. And so you can see this is not some kind of new medication or startup or breakthrough device. This is a very simple core concept, but it did have wide-reaching implications, and now it's implemented at a lot of hospitals across the country. Another very similar case is with ED-initiated buprenorphine. So for a long time, it was just assumed that the only thing emergency physicians could do with this type of issue was, discharge a person once they'd been stabilized and give them a phone number to a local rehab center. But Gail D'Onofrio and other colleagues at Yale asked a totally different question. And that's, what if the ED could actually do more than that? And they could actually start treatment instead of just simply recommending it. And again, this is initially very controversial, like a lot of good ideas are in the beginning. But the following trials and studies that were done on it really significantly increased engagement in addiction treatment and reduced the illicit opiate use compared with just the referral alone. And this is a very, very successful initiative. And is now, again, widely implemented, but was initially very met with a lot of skepticism. I think another one that a lot of physicians will recognize is the case of the very scary, toddler or infant brought in during respiratory arrest, and they're carried in by just terrified parents. The room just shifts instantly into chaos. Someone's asking for epinephrine dosing. Another person's digging through the drawers and trying to remember the correct ET tube size. Maybe a resident is kind of quickly trying to calculate weight-based doses on their phone. And every single second of this feels so compressed, even for very experienced clinicians. So you just feel your cognitive bandwidth narrowing in these moments. So James Brosolo recognized that these resuscitations were failing partly because there was too many required bedside calculations during the worst possible moment. And so he and a few colleagues invented the Brosolo tape. And throughout the 1980s, they further developed the concept. And it was later covered by patent disclosures and is now essentially a universally used device in pretty much every emergency department. Um, you can think of other examples too, like when maybe it's 2 a.m. and a senior resident is casually trying to show you how to stop a nasal cannula from cutting through an elderly patient's ears using an improvised system like alcohol pads and tape, or maybe a tech is demonstrating a splinting technique that somehow works dramatically better than all of the official orthopedic cart supplies. And you're not going to find any of this in the textbook. It's nowhere in Tintinelli you're going to read about these things. But I think a lot of medicine, especially emergency medicine, operates through kind of just things that are passed down from one person to another between exhausted people at workstations. And a lot of these tricks are really, really effective. And so Michelle Lynn and her colleagues recognized that, a huge amount of this emergency medicine knowledge lives outside of traditional textbooks and journals. And their challenge was not actually creating content for this. The challenge initially was credibility. And they responded by building a formal peer review system and structured curation and formal evaluation systems all around this kind of open access emergency medicine education. And so Tricks of the Trade is what this became. And it's available to physicians everywhere, and it's done a lot of good. In the last case, another very famous one that I think people recognize is just how difficult it can be to, coach a learning resident on how to intubate when you yourself, as the attending, cannot actually see the airway or anything going on. And this is both a very difficult and frustrating situation from an educational perspective, but extremely dangerous during one of the most high-risk procedures we do as physicians in the ED. And so again, instead of kind of just suffering through this problem, Richard Levitin, who was an emergency physician, was very frustrated by the blind coaching during the airway teaching. And so he recognized it as a systems problem, and he developed the first models for what is now video laryngoscopy. Again, a very, very widely implemented device that's essentially become basically the standard of practice in emergency medicine. But again, this just started with an ER physician who was very frustrated. So physicians everywhere in and outside of emergency medicine have built so many different devices, platforms, procedural tools, diagnostics, even entirely new delivery care models. And I think we take some of these for granted because they've become so mainstream in our everyday practices. If you think about things like the bougie device there or the Easy IO, I can't imagine a world in emergency medicine without these, but they didn't always exist. And these were all invented by frustrated ER doctors. And many of these ideas didn't begin as startup concepts. The people that became the founders behind these did not initially think of themselves as founders. They didn't think of the word startup when they were just frustrated at 3 a.m. with the inability to gain access to somebody's, veins during a high-risk resuscitation. They just began as repeated exposure to the same frustrating clinical problem. And so that's the theme that you'll see repeated throughout the rest of the talk here. So many, many worthwhile physician-built tools are not actually revolutionary. Often they're just going to be reducing friction, improving reliability, or making knowledge more visible to other people. And a surprising amount of physician entrepreneurship is just repeatedly noticing the same annoying thing that I think everyone else has just kind of accepted as normal. Specifically why it belongs in EM, and again, I think this applies broadly across many specialties, but we see the healthcare system where it fails. So whether it's boarding or bad handoffs or outpatient access failure, psychiatry gaps, unsafe discharges, all of that becomes fully visible really in the emergency department. And we're very trained to make high stakes decisions under uncertainty. And we learn to identify the important problems before all the information is available. But because we work at the intersection of all of these systems and groups that aren't necessarily communicating well together, it creates kind of strong instincts for this operational friction for us. And we notice these problems because we have to deal with them so frequently. And a lot of our job already involves, designing informal systems, whether it's redesigning workflows or improving handoffs or building safer processes for our departments under this kind of stress. The truth, though, is just a lot of physicians never really formalize or own that work that they're creating. So I do want to share just for a few slides the story of my company and how I founded it and how it evolved. And just some of the, again, successes and challenges I had along the way. So it really started during the COVID pandemic. And I remember I was I was on my last day of my general surgery rotation as a third year medical student. I just spent a grueling 6 weeks basically in the surgical department when the COVID pandemic was kind of became essentially announced in the United States. And we had our cases starting, and the medical schools especially were very quick to react and to kind of shut down operations. And essentially my medical school, a lot of things became disrupted. So I was heading into my fourth year, time when typically we would be doing a lot of sub-internship rotations and away visiting rotations to programs we were interested in. And I essentially had the entire year ripped out from under me. Same with all medical students that year. And my school was very proactive in encouraging us to develop our own solutions to it. So we could submit proposals to go do rotations that were essentially virtual or somehow safely in person. But we had to really finally navigate the rules with the COVID pandemic that year. And so my solution that I found worked fairly well was I started developing curriculum to teach wilderness medicine and to do whatever I could in wilderness medicine. And I ended up moving to Salt Lake City and getting involved in teaching there at the University of Utah and helping them develop their curriculum. And I ended up working a lot with the Salt Lake County Search and Rescue team that year. And what was really, really interesting during the pandemic is you had this paradox of all the cities shutting down and implementing distance protocols, basically. And because of that, people started flocking into the wilderness. So you had people just going in droves into places they had never gone before as a form of entertainment. So they would go hiking and camping and backpacking for the first time. And while I think there were a lot of positive effects of that, the obvious downside is that you had a huge surge of pretty unprepared people heading into dangerous places and not really knowing all the things that could affect them out there and not knowing how to deal with it when it did. And what happened this year is we had a threefold increase across the country in search and rescue calls than the year prior. And this put a huge strain on what was already a very fragile system of search and rescue. A lot of people have kind of misguided beliefs about what search and rescue is and how it operates, but it's a very, very fragmented, thin system across the United States. It often falls under the sheriff's department. It is not federally funded, and it's run by volunteers in those local communities under the sheriff's department. And these are all people that work regular day jobs and get a call at 2 a.m. that there's, a missing person. And we all pack up our bags and head out, and we fund it ourselves. And so obviously at baseline, a pretty fragile economic system behind this. And during COVID, it really, really got strained with the multifold increase in the number of calls. It was a huge issue in many areas in the US. And on top of that, during the pandemic, you saw a lot of the training systems for both the rescuers and the people just wanting to go into the outdoors were shut down because in-person courses couldn't run. There was no way to prepare people for the risks that they were taking on, or to continue to produce new search and rescue members that had the proper training. So this became a big issue that I noticed in Salt Lake City. And I thought, well, why don't we just try? I think that so much of medical education now is operated remotely. If I can do my surgical rotation remotely, there's no way that we can't, at least in part, convert this form of layperson medical education, essentially first aid in the outdoors, into something that can be delivered at scale remotely in the same capacity. And so I changed the whole curriculum and started offering a course really for the local search and rescue members in Salt Lake City about how to treat medical problems in the wilderness. And it was very, very popular. And so the next one they suggested I open up to the general community in Salt Lake City. So I posted it in a Facebook group of hikers in Salt Lake. And I woke up the next morning and more than 300 people had enrolled. And this just repeated day after day after day. And I thought, if it was this successful, delivering essentially courses over Zoom to teach backpackers, hikers, skiers, and the rescuers how to handle these emergencies in these remote places, why couldn't this be, replicated across many other communities that need it? And so that's what I did. I went into Facebook groups, hikers, backpackers, travelers, and essentially just started spreading it outside of Salt Lake City. And again, every day I would wake up and hundreds of people had enrolled in this and wanted to do it. And this just repeated month after month. And I was seeing such extraordinary numbers behind it during that year in 2021 and to 2022. That I actually ended up, well, the first thing I did, not really knowing how to operate a business at that point, was I thought, well, I need a logo. I've come a long way since then in terms of understanding business operations and how to actually run something like this. But this should just show you, you don't necessarily need to go into this knowing exactly what to do from the get-go. But I named it, found a logo that eventually was trademarked, and just filed it as a business in Salt Lake City. Again, each of these steps just felt enormous at the time because I just had no training in business knowledge and was just a fourth-year medical student at this point. And it continued to grow and just spread very, very rapidly. And initially, I found that teaching it virtually did create some early skepticism. This was a fairly long-standing model in wilderness medicine that hadn't had a lot of innovation in the several decades that courses like this had been running. And really, since the inception of this type of training, there really hadn't been a lot of market pressure for anyone to develop anything new. There were a few major instructors, companies that instructed this across the US, and there really hadn't been a lot of pressure for them to have to innovate in many years. And so I definitely did encounter some friction early on and just early skepticism, especially coming from people that had really bought into that traditional training model. But it did force me early on to really have to build intentional systems for this with engagement and standardization and scalable feedback. And I had to do it better than the traditional in-person courses had ever been developed. And so I continued to see a lot of success with this during the pandemic. And by the end of that first year, I had more than 12,000 students that had gone through this. And I was really, really surprised by how many people that went through it and how many organizations that went through it. They had experienced both the traditional in-person format and this new training that I was offering. Repeatedly, they preferred the new way. And this actually ended up surviving the pandemic. Even long after the in-person options opened again, a lot of organizations and people preferred this because of the flexibility and the lower cost and the fact that they can continue to access the material and continue to learn it many months after their course. So it really kept it fresh for them. And so the success of it in that first year, combined with just wanting to try something new in my life, I actually took a whole year, delayed residency for a year to continue to grow this and to turn it into a real company. And then, so after that first year, again, we had more than 12,000 students and it was functioning and still growing. And I was essentially still running everything by myself at this point. And one thing I didn't anticipate was just how quickly the audience would expand beyond the stereotypical outdoorsy wilderness medicine demographic. I originally imagined it serving mostly hikers and climbers and backcountry enthusiasts, but over time, the organizations that started reaching out were from completely different operational environments, whether it was EMS agencies, field crews, universities, maritime operations, things like Antarctic research programs, just tons of companies that operate in remote industrial settings. That was a really big one. And this was a really important lesson for me operationally and entrepreneurially, because I realized people often buy the solutions to the underlying problem and not necessarily the branding that you originally imagined. So the real demand wasn't necessarily just wilderness medicine. The real demand was accessible education for very limited resource decision making, operational self-reliance, and basically just managing emergencies wherever in the world you are, where the infrastructure is limited. But also, I had accidentally created a massive administrative problem for myself. This was all happening as I was starting residency a year later. And I remember getting home from 24-hour shifts on trauma surgery rotations or ICU as an intern and having to answer 5 hours of emails to keep up with these organizations. And I was still handling all the scheduling and partnerships and website issues and instructor coordination, all of that myself. So I'd basically given myself a second full-time job with worse IT support, is how I'd put that. But I think that being in residency really forced me to be extremely selective with how I was spending my energy. And I think it forced me to learn those lessons in a much more compressed format than, that may take many years for other business owners to learn. And so I started hiring just a couple key people to take over the administrative aspects for me and the marketing. And they've really become the operational backbone of the whole company today. And I really couldn't imagine continuing it without them at this point. But hiring that kind of help is also very humbling because you realize that a lot of the jobs that you think you're doing well, you're objectively not the best person to be doing them. And I think just as physicians, we can have a hard time sometimes letting go of some of those administrative tasks because we think everything is functioning well. And sometimes you don't even know how much better it can be until you let go of some of that. So things have expanded a lot since the inception of this. And so we've returned to a full spectrum of formats for the courses, whether it's completely online for people in very remote areas or that would otherwise have difficulty accessing courses, to completely in person or some hybrid of those. And what I found along the way too is that there's actually an extraordinary number of physicians and other healthcare providers that are interested in teaching this, pretty exciting topic in medicine. but they don't necessarily feel like they can start a business to do it, or they don't want to. Their level of interest is enough to teach, but not enough to operate a whole business around it. And so I found that this was common enough that we needed an entire pathway to allow people to do that. And so essentially, we've created a model that's basically like a small franchise with it now. So we have about 300 instructors across the country now, in 21 states, and we're adding new ones every single day. And it really took off in areas of the world that I didn't expect, like Hong Kong and South America. There were some areas that were just so desperate and so interested in starting programs to be able to teach people these things. Now more than 40,000 students have gone through the formal trainings with Survival Med, and we have an additional about 50,000 that have gone through various free community programs we've run. And we have lots of EMS training agency partnerships now, in states like California and Idaho and Arkansas and Pennsylvania and the Southeast. That's another pathway that I've seen expand a lot that I didn't initially even think of myself. We've also opened up internships for third and fourth year medical students, and actually at every level, we have interns that are creating content and courses and exploring their interests in wilderness medicine. And often they're able to get credit to do that. And I essentially turned around and tried to create the very thing that I wish had existed when the pandemic struck, when I was a medical student. And it's been really cool to be able to offer that for a lot of other people. And I think a big thing I've noticed too since starting all of this is, again, getting back to the idea that the concepts that are taught through this system are so much broader than just for backpackers and skiers and people that identify with those niches. It's really about expanding limited resource care to all areas that need it and that are far from traditional medical systems. And I think over time, what I've actually found is that the wilderness medicine branding aspect alone is actually fairly limiting in this space. It's not right for the people who don't think of themselves as, rugged hikers or backcountry skiers. But it really applies to so many of these folks who live hours away from even a critical access hospital, and they really have to be self-reliant when stuff happens out there. So we've started other training programs like the immediate responder program. It's a lot of the same concepts that are implemented in wilderness medicine, but you just kind of change the branding and change the delivery of it, and you see how much more wide-reaching that can go. It's also been really neat to be able to kind of turn around and help the same rescue systems that were so strained even before the pandemic and then increasingly afterwards. So the No Barriers program is designed to provide resources for search and rescue and emergency response teams in these communities where they can actually take the survival med courses and go teach and sell them in their communities, and then use that revenue to actually fund their operations. So this has been a really cool program to see. And then I think one of the most unexpected parts of building something outside of traditional clinical work is that you'll see opportunities begin to compound. And these are things like collaborations, speaking invitations, consulting roles, media projects. You can open up entirely new career pathways that emerge from the original project in ways that I think are completely impossible to predict at the beginning. So things like during my second year of residency, the former producers of Mythbusters and some other agents emailed me because they wanted to start a new survival reality show, and they wanted to base it on real search and rescue cases. So they brought together previous successful contestants of Alone and Survivor. And so we've filmed 2 seasons of this now, and it's still kind of being developed into either a survival competition or kind of a reality branding behind it. I'm not sure where it'll go, but I think they're still kind of working with different networks and deciding who to work with. But It's been really fun to be a medical director for this, both on and off camera. And you just kind of see how these projects come out of nowhere. And this is stuff that I never would have even thought of when I was starting out. And enough of these started landing in my inbox that again, I decided to follow the theme and create something real out of it. So we called that the Red Line Project. And so I've helped a huge variety now of different projects, whether it's film crews that are trying to film movies in remote areas, to small expedition groups or research groups that just need some basic training and preparation for the areas that they're going to be in that maybe don't have cell service or are in really extreme environments. A couple examples are like Team Do the Thing, rowing 3,200 miles across the ocean with no engines, no sails, no support boat. Orca expeditions, they're going for a world record in 2027, the transatlantic east to west rowing, and then they're going to sail in the opposite direction. And so these, again, projects that just started landing in my inbox and kind of decided to create something formal out of it. But I think that this overall was such a simple idea, just teaching wilderness medicine over Zoom was essentially the whole concept early on, but it had such far-reaching consequences in my life and really changed the entire trajectory of my career. So I think hopefully this message resonates with people in that you don't have to think of something brilliant. I don't even think it was a brilliant idea to begin with. It was just something that had a real impact that people needed and answered a fairly simple problem. So I just want to talk about a couple different categories of physician-led pathways, just again to get the wheels turning for people and recognizing that entrepreneurship can look like so many different things. Most of the important physician-built work, especially in emergency medicine, is not going to be a device or a company. It's redesigning how care is delivered. So you can think about things like teletriage, follow-up systems, virtual observations. Most of these don't start as a business idea. They just begin because physicians repeatedly encounter the same unsafe or inefficient failures in patient care. A large amount of really meaningful work is operational rather than technological. So you can think about like redesigning workflows, communication systems, safety systems. These projects often sound less exciting initially than startups or devices, but they directly affect patient safety and workload and operational reliability. And these can be very scalable if that's what you want to do with it. I think to add to that too, I think overall I've noticed medicine and clinical work, clinical medicine, often the culture in it kind of mistakes the ability to tolerate bad systems for professionalism. And I think if you notice that a department has developed multiple unofficial workarounds for the same recurring problem, that usually means that the system itself has never actually been fixed. And so those informal workarounds are often evidence that your frontline staff are already doing kind of the invisible redesign work behind this. When it comes to medical devices, I think that physicians often will just begin with the thought of why are we still doing it this way? Or I keep improvising the same workaround on every shift. And a lot of these really impactful tools are not futuristic technologies. They're just practical attempts to reduce friction, offload some of the cognitive weight, or just failure points during real clinical work. So whether it's a new splinting system or just a quick cognitive aid, or an airway setup redesign, a lot of these projects can evolve into software or digital diagnostics or things like that, but they often start as a very simple idea. And I think we're really uniquely positioned to identify these problems because we repeatedly experience equipment and workflow failures. And then to wrap up the categories here with a couple more, I think education products themselves are some of the most scalable and transferable systems you can build. Um, so, like educational property could be courses, podcasts, recorded lectures, digital curricula. And I think the take home message that I've learned through operating in this category is that it's not the content alone that makes it successful. What makes ventures successful in this category are um, how well you execute your audience trust, the operational structure behind what you're doing, how frictionless you make the system for people, how good your marketing is. And it goes so far beyond just how good is the content alone.
I could chime in on that real quick. Since I've done the laceration course and the abscess courses, people often come to me and, hey, I've got this great idea for a course. Do you think somebody will buy it from me for, certain, $10,000, $20,000, $50,000? I'm like, no, nobody's going to do that. You
No,
have to sell the course. You have to get out there.
yeah,
You have to market it. You have to show up on social media. You have to be involved in all, different Facebook groups. It's a lot of work.
yeah,
And it looks like, because if you just create, and I tell people, creating the course, yes, it's work, but that's the easy part. You got to
yeah,
sell it. And that's just not a skill set that many of us feel comfortable with. There's kind of this element of, you feel dirty trying to sell something, and it's hard. So,
yeah,
kudos to you for, for what you've built, what you've created. And I think that's a very, very strong message. It's not just the content. You have to sell it.
yeah.
You have to market
Yep,
it.
I think that there's kind of a misconception that of this idea of passive income,
Hmm.
where you can create a one-time digital product or a one-time system and just put it out in the world and expect that it's gonna, grow and that people will buy it. I think the concept of passive income in physician endeavors specifically is very misguided. There are some systems, certainly, and some ways of investing that truly are passive. But if you're building a product or you're expecting a service or any kind of venture to be financially viable, it takes a lot of work actually, and I don't think that it's I don't think that there's a lot of cases where people can just build something one time and expect it to be this evergreen kind of um, financially viable system for them.
For sure.
And I can touch on that more at the end too, but other things that I think people do frequently but don't necessarily formalize into a business structure like they could be doing. Um, Event medicine, EMS medical direction, utilization review, med legal. A lot of physicians do this kind of here and there, but for reasons I'll share in a few slides, I think that a lot of people would benefit from actually formalizing the structure around what they're doing just a little bit more for some reasons I'll share shortly. So I do want to touch on just this concept of like, how do you build a practical framework for something real? And that's just starting with a very small, safe, reality tested construction for something. So, for people that are interested in this space but don't really know where to begin, I really encourage them to take just 2 weeks and keep a friction log. And that is, it could be clinical or it could be non clinical in your everyday life. Write down anything that's frustrating you in your everyday life as you're going through it. If it's clinical, it could be things like repeated delays, workarounds you're developing, unsafe handoffs, equipment mismatches, anything, no matter how big or small, I'd write it down. And then once you have 2 weeks worth of data, you have enough then to look at it and kind of prioritize the frequency of it, the clinical consequence or the life consequence of it, And whether an emergency physician in that system can realistically influence it. So the key line here is don't start with whatever's clever. You need to start with what keeps happening. And then you want to verify that this problem is real. And so I would try to pull one simple local measure before you build anything, whether it's length of stay for those patients or the revisit rate or patient comprehension or staff injury or violence reports. One objective measure is what you need, because really, if you can't define an outcome with something, you don't have a project yet. You really just have a complaint at that stage. And then the next very simple step is to start to talk to people that live around that problem, that live in the workflow, is what I'd call it. So you want to interview multiple stakeholders before you design anything, whether it's the residents or the nurses or the pharmacists or the supply chain or the administrators. So you're just asking very simple questions here, and this doesn't have to be a formal interview. It's just, what is the problem actually? Who feels it? What is the current workaround that we've already designed? Would you make a switch to a different system if we had it? And why would you say no or yes to that answer? And a really important key thing here too is you want to expect your first framing to change. So your understanding of the issue and its potential solution is probably going to change as you talk to these different people. And the next really basic but important concept is the idea of a minimum viable product, or the MVP. And this is a very widespread idea in entrepreneurship, but it's essentially the smallest realistic version of an idea that allows you to test whether the problem is real, whether the workflow actually helps that you can create for it, and whether people will realistically use it. So for me, my minimum viable product in the first days of survival med was a literal Zoom link that people could log into on the most basic website you could imagine, and they could pay through a very simple Stripe system to access it. And then they would get on a Zoom session with hundreds of other people as I gave a lecture, and they would submit by video and photos to me their skills for me to manually grade. And this system was very, very simple compared to what we have running today. And it's almost embarrassing to look back at your minimum viable product, but it should be. Years after you've poured effort into something to make it much better, you should look at your minimum viable product and think, I can't believe that worked at that stage. But that's how this whole thing works. Oftentimes we overestimate how much energy and work you have to put into that minimum viable product, when really what you want to do is get your first good small test out in the market, and then allow the market to teach you how to do it. And you're going to learn so much more from gathering that feedback than you will continuing to stew over this night after night, not having any real product out there getting that feedback. Just telling people about your idea or stressing over whether it's a good one. You really just want to get this MVP out there, and then you're going to get the data fairly quickly. And this is especially important for physicians to understand this concept, I think, because we have a tendency to be such perfectionists. And I think in many cases where I talk to physicians that are interested in starting a venture of some kind, they've been thinking about it for 5 or 10 years. And they've been wondering for a long time if it would work. And they've been talking to tons and tons of people, but not actually testing their solution. So in healthcare, sometimes the concept of a minimum viable product may not be enough, depending on what you're building. So the right framework in some clinical systems could be a minimum safe test. So you can imagine, we can't just throw a drug out into the market and call it a minimum viable product. There's a lot of background protocols and testing that has to happen before that type of innovation can take place. So that applies in other areas of healthcare as well. But the same system is at play here. So you want to start with the least risky version, whether it's like just a checklist or a discharge template, or a prototype that's used under supervised conditions or offline. And this is often how these bigger concepts start, is just a very, very small, safe test of it. And then you want to choose the right home for the work. And you don't need to start with a company. And I think a lot of good physician ideas die because people assume that the first stage is to turn it into a company. And that's where all of their energy goes. Instead of thinking to start off with, should this be a QI project or a simple educational product we test, a licensable tool, a consulting practice, or should it be one of those kind of exceptions that should start as a startup? And I think that people complicate this too quickly. You want to choose the lowest denominator here to start and test your idea. And then I think another concept at play in that same category is that modern entrepreneurship culture and talk really promotes this hustle culture idea, where it assumes that every idea that's good should continuously grow. And I just think that not every physician built project needs to become large in order to become valuable. A lot of work is best as a sustainable niche practice or a regional program or an educational system that's actually closely tied to the physician's actual interests and lifestyle. Scaling is often going to produce a lot of management burden, staffing problems, legal complexity, loss of flexibility. So a more useful question is not going to be how big could this become, but what size supports the life and the work that I actually want to be doing. So your scaling should be intentional rather than automatic. And before you think about scaling, you really need to think about the operational pathway. And a lot of good ideas that physicians come up with end up not working, not because they aren't good in concept or successful in theory. It's because they never poured enough thought or time or resources into figuring out how this is going to work in other physicians' workflows. So you really need to figure out, how are people going to adopt this into their everyday practice or life? How frictionless is it for people to adopt it? And, what success rate are we seeing with that? So I think that you really want to track, if it's a clinical project, one clinical metric, one operational metric, and maybe one adoption metric. And you really need to understand how good the adoption is before you try to scale something. And then I'll touch briefly on different funding pathways. Different money solves different problems, and it can also create new problems for you if you're not careful about how you're doing this. And funding is not mutually exclusive, so it can evolve over time. You can fit into different categories, and you can start as one and kind of evolve into another over time. Self-funded is the most common physician pathway here. So there's a lot of advantages to being self-funded. You retain total control, you make very fast decisions, and it can grow at the rate that you want it to beside your clinical work. I think there's enormous power in being able to wake up every day and say, this is the decision I've made with something, and not have to get anyone else's approval in making that decision in your own business. The disadvantages of self-funded are it can be much slower. You do take on some level of personal financial risk, obviously, but I think that the level of that risk can be drastically overstated when you're thinking about general entrepreneurship culture. I think people envision, these rogue entrepreneurs quitting their job and risking it all to start a venture. That's rarely what it looks like. It often starts as a very rational, small project that you kind of pour more resources into as it's proven as an idea. Physician loans do exist for starting ventures. I think a lot of people just are not aware of this as a concept. But just like you can get specific physician loans for houses, you can also get physician loans for new businesses. And so there are certain banks that are well known for offering physician lending. And so sometimes you can get like lower collateral and flexible underwriting and future income consideration for these loans. I just would caution people in general about taking on a lot of new debt before you've really validated the demand for your concept. And for physicians that are working within institutions, you really should do research into what your institution might be able to do to support you in it. I think a lot of good concepts should begin as local operational pilots rather than immediately becoming companies. And academic medical centers are often already going to contain pilot funding, QI funding, innovation grants, engineering collaborators, but a lot of doctors just never ask about these things. And so, as the physicians, we understand the entire workflow and the operational bottlenecks and exactly where a system is failing. But you don't need to be the one to personally engineer the technical solution to it. So, your contribution might just be the knowledge and not necessarily the technology that solves it. And so that's where really just having a few simple conversations at your institution can connect you with the people that can help you bridge that gap. And oftentimes, conceptually, we lump all funding together, but there are big, big differences between research grants and educational grants and innovation funding. And I think, again, a very simple conversation can open a lot of doors for you if you start asking these questions. One particularly important category is the SBIR and STTR funding pathway, and that provides federal non-dilutive funding for small business innovation. So these are commonly going to be used for medical devices and diagnostics and like healthcare software or digital health. But SBIR is small business innovation research, and STTR is small business technology transfer. And the really key word is non-dilutive. So no one is gonna come claiming equity in your business or your venture after you are granted one of these. And then I would encourage people to look into strategic partnerships too. Again, just start thinking outside of the box that you have to be the one building everything behind this, because there could be an already existing system, company, agency that is interested in the concept that you're thinking about and has more resources to maybe act on it. And you could potentially partner with them to build it out. And you don't need to build everything yourself in these kinds of systems. So think about device companies or EMS agencies or simulation centers, places that might already inherently have a stake or an interest in your concept. And then I'll speak briefly on venture capital. And I think it's a it's kind of a funny backstory with this, but I did residency in Southern California as I was continuing to build survival med, and um, I was surrounded by an ecosystem in Southern California where venture capital was very normalized in these discussions. And I remember one resort in San Diego in particular that I would actually sneak into all the time because they had an amazing pool and they hosted amazing conferences there that often had free happy hours. And so I would show up, and a lot of these conferences would be like innovation, startup conferences, entrepreneurship conferences. And I would have a lot of interesting discussions at these happy hours with a lot of different founders and funders. And I realized that venture culture and kind of the money behind it is used as this kind of like social capital almost down there. And it's really, really common to hear people say things like, oh, I've raised $2 million, or my business or company or idea has raised $10 million. And they never seem to share that somewhere along the line, very early in the process, they gave up so much ownership and control and future flexibility very, very early on by raising this venture capital. And it can sound externally very impressive, but it creates a lot of enormous pressure around growth and timelines and scaling and satisfying the investor expectations. It's not free money. It just fundamentally changes who influences the direction and the pace of your project. It does fit well for projects that have very large markets, are already proven scalable systems, if you have defensible intellectual property and expectations for rapid growth. But outside of that narrow subset, I would say most physician built projects are going to be better off self-funded or with a small business loan to start. You don't need to think that you need to go pitch your idea on Shark Tank or to any venture capital markets anywhere that early on in your process. And I think this concept as a whole is just intimidating to people, and part of the reason that people, shy away from starting a venture. Another really important topic before I close out is on intellectual property. And I think the important misconception to talk about here is that every good healthcare idea needs a patent. Most physician ideas are either not patentable or do not need a patent to be valuable. And so when you're talking about workflows or broad concepts or clinical processes, they're often going to be difficult or impossible to patent. More patent friendly things are going to be like devices, software systems, algorithms, hardware. But again, you don't need a patent in order to be successful or valuable here. Um, Oftentimes, a physician built business is going to be successful because of its operational execution, your distribution, your trust with your market, your audience, and how well you run things behind the scenes, not on any patent in that process. And if you are at an academic center, I really want to caution people that one of your first stops, if you're developing anything, should be something like a technology transfer office, or maybe called other things at other institutions. But you really want to stop and talk to them before you develop anything, before you publish it, before you talk about licensing, before you even write it down. I would go and talk to the technology transfer office, because I've seen a lot of sad cases where academic physicians built something, innovated something, developed a concept, and didn't realize that their institution would claim ownership over it. I've been shocked over the years as I've learned about how far reaching the consequences of this can be, even years after you leave an institution. Some of these institutions will come after these physicians and claim ownership over any intellectual property that they developed while they were working as a physician there. And even if you're doing it in your spare time and it has nothing to do with your institution, you really want to make sure that you have that ironed out and documented early in the process so that you don't fall victim to this.
And I think this is an area where it is absolutely essential for you to at least consider getting a solid attorney to help you navigate this, and not just throw it into ChatGPT and ask it
Yeah.
what you should be doing.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I harp on a lot with my colleagues is investing in themselves and investing in consultants who can help them navigate this stuff so that they're not doing it alone. And I think that this is one of those areas that is absolutely crucial to make sure that everything is in line, so that you don't get that surprise a year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. Oh, we own
Mhm.
that. Thank you. Where
Yeah.
are our royalties? Where's our ownership? Where's our piece of the pie?
Yeah. And
So
it's often
definitely,
only going to be when something becomes successful that
exactly.
you'll see the sharks coming after you for it.
Yes. Yes.
So
If it
you
ends up being
really,
a flop, they're
yeah,
definitely not going to be opening up their checkbook to write you a
yeah,
check for your failings. But
yeah.
they are definitely going to be opening up their hand looking for a check if it's successful.
Yeah, and it's just not a battle you want to even have to
No,
fight years
nope.
later. And it's often very difficult to prove
Hmm.
years later, what resources you were using, who you were talking to.
Right.
So having that all documented at the very earliest stages is actually the most important
Yep.
time to be documenting it.
Yep.
I think a lot of people have heard of patents, but they haven't heard of a simpler concept, which is provisional patents. And this is a very practical starting point for early ideas. So, a provisional patent is kind of a lower cost temporary filing, and it establishes an early filing date while you're deciding whether the idea is worth developing any further. So traditional patents can cost many, many hours of your time and thousands of dollars to establish, but provisional patents are much simpler and I think just friendlier as a starting option. Um, and a provisional patent can create enough protection to be able to discuss your idea more safely, talk to device companies, build prototypes, seek collaborators for it. And a lot of physician ideas are ultimately going to be licensed or sold or co-developed. They're not going to be necessarily developed start to finish by the physician who thinks of it. And you really want to retain your ability to sell that concept. And so a provisional patent early on just helps start the process of formalizing the protection for you in that.
Yep.
I know EM physicians actually specifically who have developed entire careers into just thinking of new devices, hiring a simple sketch artist to create a model of what they're describing, filing provisional patents, and then selling those provisional patents to device companies, small, medium-sized device companies who have developed similar tools. And they've made entire livings off of this. A lot of those tools, a lot of them go nowhere. They may get developed into early stages and then just kind of abandoned by those device companies. But some of those tools have done exceptionally well. So there is obviously a wide spectrum with this, but just as a concept, I want people to know that provisional patents are a thing. And then I'll just touch lightly on business structure. I think at some point I realized I had accidentally become the type of person who voluntarily watches YouTube videos about S Corp taxation. I don't know when that started or how to go back, but the point is that you don't need an elaborate corporate structure immediately. Most early projects are going to begin simply, and you can elect a business structure if it makes sense for your project. Under certain types, you can kind of move laterally between these if it makes sense at certain stages. And the structure is going to affect your taxes, your liability, your protection, your payroll, all those things. These concepts, I think, are just actually easier to learn than a lot of people make it seem, and you're not stuck in one category. You do have ability to kind of change over time. And then to close out, I just have a couple more slides, but I just want to touch on this idea of the tax power of the mildly successful side hustle. And the M is very intentionally chosen. I do not mean a wildly successful side hustle. I think that one of the biggest misconception that physicians have is that a business only counts if it's immediately enormously profitable. And in reality, a lot of early stage businesses operate at a loss on paper for several years. And the IRS actually expects that while you're building infrastructure, traveling, developing content, the IRS is expecting you to operate at a loss. And if you think about what that means in practical terms, a legitimate business can have huge tax advantages, even if it's not yet profitable. So you can be writing off things like CME and travel and equipment and marketing and a home office. You can make a huge difference on your bottom line by formalizing a business structure just early on around what you're doing. And you have to have a real business here. So you have to have, attempts that are visible at, revenue attempts, real documentation, intent. But I think a lot of these systems are actually simpler than people imagine them being. There are services that can help with this, very quickly and just helping you navigate the tax world behind this. But it is a very, very powerful option. And I'll show you an example chart here. So let's say we have physician A and physician B are both employees at the same hospital. They have the same base salary and they do the same side work essentially. They spend roughly the same amount of hours across the year doing random conferences, speaking engagements, educational services, random little consulting things here and there. But physician B has actually structured all of that into a side business. And physician A just kind of does it more haphazardly. Well, physician B has unlocked a whole, category of benefits. So you can take legitimate deductions in a lot of those categories that you may not necessarily be able to do without that structured side business. You
Yeah.
open up entirely new retirement flexibility. You can, and then on top of all of that, you're building something that has inherent financial value if you did want to sell it, several years down the line. And then I think just to touch on networking, a lot of opportunities emerge not from applications or job postings, but just from relationships. And I think really it's important to focus on longitudinal relationships rather than transactional. I'd encourage, like, as you're going to conferences and just meeting new people, just sending follow up emails. A simple follow up email matters enormously for staying in contact and kind of staying memorable to people. And I think you don't need to think of this as selling yourself. And I think that's the wrong framework for it. It's more about just becoming repeatedly known as someone who understands that problem well and builds useful things and follows through reliably. And you'll see this, your networking compound a lot over time if
Yep.
that's kind of the version that you're going for. Um, and then and then another practical thing that I've picked up on is just keeping a running document of interesting people that I meet. And this can be inside and outside of medicine, but maybe it's the person next to me on a plane who's a patent attorney, or it's somebody in a bar that has dealt with business structure before. I just keep a running list of these people, and it's been extraordinary the connections it's garnered over time. I'll be able to look back and think, oh, 3 years ago I met somebody, and I have their email or their contact, and I can reach out to them, and they fit this specific new problem that I have run into. And it's been a really, really good thing, is just keeping that running list going. You never
And
really know who's going to turn into a collaborator later on.
I could not agree with you more. Um, yeah, the connections, the collaboration, not being afraid to reach out to somebody. You see an interesting post on LinkedIn, reach out to that person. Don't be
Yeah.
afraid of connecting and having a conversation, having your calendar link, with Calendly or some other scheduling platform. Send that over to them. Anything that you can do to reduce the friction of getting on the phone
Mhm.
with somebody or having a Zoom call with them is very, very important. It eliminates the back and forth, the email, trying to schedule something. Like you, I've never deleted an email, or very few. I've got every single connection for the last 20 years still in my phone. And you just never know when you can be of service to somebody else and help them with the problem that
Yeah.
they're navigating, and vice versa. And honestly, that's a lot of the reason why I built Shift Change, and a lot of the people who are in the community are there for that reason. They're people that I've connected with over the years. I mean, some are in, completely different industries. They've got completely different skill sets, but I've got
Mhm.
something of value for them, and they in turn have something of value for me, and really trying to bring
Yeah.
all of those people together to streamline and again reduce that friction of finding the right person. And I think that, we as
Yeah.
physicians, we silo ourselves. We stay a little bit isolated and we're afraid to reach out, but that's how things happen. And you've got to
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
out of your comfort zone and start reaching out, making connections and having conversations.
Yeah. And I've also found a couple other things that I've just learned along the way. I think we often underestimate how willing and excited people are to talk about
Yeah.
themselves and what they've built and
Yep.
what they do.
Hmm.
And and how willing they are to help other people and
Yep,
excited and how good that makes people feel.
it
So
does.
I think physicians really, I've seen a pattern where they feel like things have to be transactional or they're expecting,
Right.
somebody's going to want to charge me X amount of dollars to even have a conversation with
Mhm.
them, yada, yada. I do think as you grow something and as you're thinking about your time, you do have to be careful with giving too much away,
Mhm.
and realize that your time is valuable too. And if at a certain point you do feel like you need to charge a consulting fee or something, I think some of that can be totally rational, but everyday casual conversations are really the backbone
Yep.
of a lot of ideas. And I think that physicians should lean more towards that and more
Mhm.
into that.
Yeah.
And I think that also, starting out building my business, I was very afraid that someone was going to come along and steal it. I don't
Yeah.
know why I had that anxiety. Um, but for the first couple of years, it kept me up at night. This idea
Yeah.
that, because what I built wasn't necessarily, this thing that I could claim a patent over. It
Right.
wasn't a specific technology that I could make exclusively mine. Technically, anybody else could come along and do it, and there were copycats along the way. But what
Mhm.
I did find was it gets back to what I mentioned earlier on a different slide, is that the success behind something is rarely the content alone. It's going to be the people you have on your team. It's going to be how good you are at communicating and building your network around you. And it's going to be how well you are at running things behind the scenes.
Yeah.
That's what makes something really successful. People can
Yeah.
come along and try to copy it, and they're not gonna do it. So
And it's the execution, like you said, the people
yeah,
around you, the execution and the service.
yeah,
Are you showing up? Are you answering those emails? Are you going above and beyond? Are you
yeah,
providing for them what they need? Are you open to their feedback? And genuinely, are you just a good person? If you're
yeah,
going to be there for the customers and the clients that you serve, they're going to keep coming back. They're going to recommend you. They're going to ping you and say, "Hey, this is a great idea. I just wanted to share this with you."
yeah, yep,
So,
exactly.
well, Natalie, this has been probably one of the best webinars that we've had so far in the Shift Change webinar series. This has been
Awesome.
just an absolute goldmine of information. We look forward to getting it edited, cleaned up, and out there on YouTube for anybody and everybody to watch. You are inside of Shift Change, and anybody who's watching this can connect with you there. I've already put your LinkedIn
Absolutely.
profile, your website. It's been a while since we've had an in-depth conversation like this, and you just absolutely blow me away. You have done so much in such a short period of time. I know it doesn't feel like that when you're going through it, but you are the poster child of, being successful as a physician entrepreneur. So thank you for your
Well, I
time.
appreciate that. Thank you
Thank you
so
for
much.
your
This has been great.
expertise. And yeah, look forward to having a more in-depth conversation. I've got some connections and some ideas that I'd love to share with you. But thank you.
Absolutely.
And good luck on your
Yes.
next chapter as you finish up your fellowship and head back out west.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye.